Hello, everybody. We are today making a video on the collaboration with MIT from India, NUS from Singapore, and UZH from Zurich in Switzerland. And today we will talk about a few key findings, essentially, that we made during our research, where we really wanted to figure out what the status quo in agriculture was, and to really understand what the perception of pesticides, synthetic pesticides, as well as GMOs was on consumer side. So I think I'll start straight ahead. And I think on the farmer side, to be honest, we found more or less what we might have expected. I think we really found two distinct groups, those being the organic and the more conventional farming sides, where organic farmers were clearly against the use of synthetic pesticides, and GMOs were usually, taken with a grain of salt. But we found as an example, on more conventional farming, that glyphosate, which is a herbicide, was becoming more and more expensive. So they were actually open to good alternatives. How was it on your side? Maybe Vedant first?
Oh yeah, sure. So actually, farms in Singapore are generally welcome towards biopesticides that are non-GMO and approved by regulatory bodies in Singapore. So most major farms in Singapore are organic due to changes in consumer preferences. And since organic farms don't use synthetic pesticides, they're open to the idea of biopesticides, which are effective. So there are three main considerations that farms use when adopting a biopesticide in our case, which is the safety approval by different regulatory bodies, namely SFA or Singapore Food Agency, GMAC or Genetic Modification Advisory Committee, as well as their own internal advisory bodies that they do look into when they see whether they want to adopt a solution that is provided to them. Yeah. What about you, Jaden? What do you find?
Well, for us, we also had two distinct groups, with organic farmers and more conventional farmers being there. For the organic farmers, on the contrary, it's funny because for us, the organic farmers and the conservative farmers had more of the same view, where if it's effective, they will use it. And they were aware of the risk that excessive pesticide usage has on the environment. But the fact of the matter is that pests are just so resistant to pesticides that you have to use more chemical pesticides. And I think they wouldn't mind a genetically modified alternative or a biopesticide like that, because as long as it's effective, they're willing to use it. And that is the sort of mentality that is here in the farms of India. In fact, one of the pesticides we've used is so toxic that it doesn't just kill the pests, but it kills snakes and frogs and other wildlife around it. And then the smell of it was very pungent. It was a very strong smelling thing when we went on our field visits. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see this sort of state we are in right now. And I don't think the farmers themselves would have any problems against accepting GMOs as long as they were accepted by a regulatory body.
Actually, that's interesting that you mentioned when they're accepted by regulatory bodies. Are there any standards they look for, or what are the key criteria you need to meet in order to be accepted by regulatory bodies, say in India or even in Switzerland?
So in Switzerland, there would be the BAG, Bundesamt für Gesundheit, which is essentially a ministry for human health, where obviously everything that goes into safety in general terms obviously has to go through them. But then again, there are very clear regulations on what can be used and what can't be used, and for, in Switzerland at least, it's very highly kind of challenged whether a pesticide has to be used before it is allowed. Then again, obviously in organic farming, there are very particular exemptions. For example, copper is considered a natural product, so it can be used in organic farming as a pesticide. As a consequence, actually, we spoke to other universities, and they figured out that there are significant copper residues in the soil that really harm the soil quality long term. So that's definitely also something that's not ideal even in organic farming. Very good. Then on the science side, we spoke to a few people, and I mentioned the copper residues in the soil. We actually spoke to a research entity in Zurich, where they've been researching on soil quality and the amount of different pesticides in the soil. The institute being the Agroscope research facility, and they found out really that even on organic farming soil, even after 20 years of organic farming, they found that there were a significant amount of different pesticides still in the ground, showing that it's just there clearly is a need for reducing the amount of pesticides used, because if we do it now, it's going to have consequences in a few decades time. So that was definitely something that took me by surprise as well, I think.
That's very interesting. What about you, Chetan? Did you have anything to share as well on those lines?
Yeah, for us, mostly the science part of things was said that we should work closely with the regulatory body. So the official regulatory body for India is the BRAI, which is the Biotechnology Regulatory Association of India, and they're the ones who acknowledge most GMO products that are to be used. And we have been in talks with the Center of Sustainable Agriculture in India, which is an association which basically talks about sustainable agriculture. And the scientists that we spoke to there also have been working on GMO crops, and they mentioned very valid points about how experiments revolving GMOs to be released on the field especially are to be carried out over a long-term period of like 5 to 10 years, and that's usually the time it takes for GMOs on the field to be accepted. And even other industry experts came to the same conclusion, and they said that we have to test for 5 to 10 years in a controlled environment and try and see what kind of effect the climate could have, because bacterial systems like our project are very erratic in the sense they'll grow differently in different climatic conditions. So there's a lot of things to consider on that aspect as well. What did you guys at NUS find out?
Actually, it's very interesting because we have two key bodies that we contacted: SFA, which is the Singapore Food Authority, as well as GMAC, which is the Genetic Modified Organisms Advisory Committee. And what they told us was that although there is a general aversion towards GMO, where GMAC specifically advised us against GMO pesticides or biopesticides for that matter, SFA, on the other hand, has a fast track available for biopesticides that are considered generally safe or reduced risk pesticides. So it's very interesting because at one hand, they would like to have biopesticides that are safe, but on the other hand, they are very averse of GMO groups. So I think it's a very fine balance that we need to strive towards in Singapore, at least, where we need to create a biopesticide that is safe and generally considered low risk, because we don't want like agricultural toxicity happening in humans. But at the same time, it should not be ideally a GMO product. Yeah.
I find that very interesting that although there is means for you to fast track production of things like this, that the aversion is still there. So what do you think about the perception of consumers in your areas, and how does that play a role?
I think that's very interesting because we did a consumer attitude survey as well, and we found out that over half the respondents think biopesticides are safe and environmentally friendly. But at the same time, I think there's also a lack of consumer education in some fronts, and we need to educate more individuals on the safety of biopesticides and even GMO products where they're not actually harmful towards humans. Because I think the way regulation changes is with change in public perception. Because when public starts to see GMO products as safe and know that they are completely safe in humans, I think regulators will follow suit as well. So it's good to know that at least 50% of the respondents have a positive attitude towards biopesticides and consider them generally safer than regular pesticides.
That's actually interesting as well. I mean, we came to the conclusion that in Switzerland specifically, there is a certain maybe negative connotation to GMOs in general, because I'll say organic farming has made great efforts to kind of equate GMOs to bad to a certain degree at least, and so organic farming to good. which is why a lot of people have a lot of concerns, towards GMO products in the food sector, at least. I mean, obviously in pharma and medicine, there is, even on a regulatory side, a lot more going on with GMOs. But we realized that, even if we were to change current laws in Switzerland, which prohibits the use of GMOs in the food sector, people might not actually buy it just because they have, a certain fear of GMOs, and they don't really understand, what entices GMOs. So there is, there is just, everything that's. I mean, in Switzerland, there are different cases, obviously, in terms of genome editing. That's gene technically. How do you say it in English? Gentech in German. So genetic engineering, essentially. And so that's not allowed. But there are different cases where there are cases where you can use a radioactive source to induce mutations, and that's actually allowed in Switzerland because it has what you call a history of safe use, which in our eyes doesn't really make that much sense, But then again, it's just historically has been more proven. So there are still a lot of things, and we kind of figured out to kind of sum it up that education on the matter really helps a lot of people, because it helps them understand what actually goes on in genome editing, and just the fact that modern genome editing can really work wonders in terms of putting to good use what we've learned about resistances, for example.
That's quite interesting. I mean, for India, it was quite an interesting take, if I might say, because the consumers that we reached out to didn't particularly have an aversion towards GMOs. The only problem they were thinking of is if GMOs would be able to sustain our growing population. And I think that's where the perspective sort of changes, because for India, agriculture is very important, because we have like the second largest population in the world, and we need to feed the mouths that are there in the country. So it's interesting because the consumers don't really have an aversion to GMOs. They're more concerned about if GMOs were implemented, if the price would change. And I think industry experts would agree that around 20 to 25% increase in price would be there. But there was also a case where one scientist we reached out to who also grew crops, he spoke about how the middleman is what raises prices, because in India the middleman controls the supply and the demand and basically hikes the prices and controls the prices. So according to them, there wouldn't be much of a change in the prices. Is there a similar situation for you guys?
To add on to that, Chetan, it's very surprising that that's the case in India. But in Singapore, we don't have a middleman. So we try to do a bit more research on how we could drive the costs down for biopesticides, because that could be a big hurdle towards making food inaccessible, given that if expensive biopesticides are used on crops, that inadvertently increases the price of crops, making food security a bigger issue. So what we found is that we consulted bioproduction companies to find a way to minimize production costs, and we found out that currently biopesticides are expensive and difficult to scale up, and it's hard to maintain safety standards because the purification procedures are costly. And thus we came up with easier and cheaper purification methods that would be much more cost effective, as well as making bioreactors that are cost effective and scalable. So we think that could help in our case to reduce and keep the costs down, because if you're able to make biopesticides or produce them cheaper and purify them cheaply, we can still use biopesticides in day-to-day life in farms in Singapore, but at the same time keep costs down for crops. Yeah.
No, I mean, in Switzerland, it's fairly similar. I mean, I don't think that we have the same issues as in India, for example, with the middlemen, driving the cost up. But we have seen that, there is on a state side an awareness that certain pesticides should be reduced, and so also farmers, as a consequence, get to feel that there are less and less pesticides used, to the point where we try to use just what is needed. Even if, in reality, obviously that's not necessarily the case. Still quite large amounts are used. But to go back to the example of glyphosate that I used, it's quite clear actually that there is, that use of glyphosate is going down quite significantly. And so for those farmers that still are using it, price is going up, which kind of induces this feedback loop where if this goes on, obviously it's going to get to a point where an alternative is needed, because it's just going to become too expensive to be financially viable.
It's a very interesting point. I mean, in the end, if you look at things at a bigger picture, we need to look at genetic engineering as a tool to further improve this kind of situation that the entire world is in, and look at the bigger picture in that sense, because even though the projects that we are working on are small, it's these small efforts that come together and make changes happen. And I think it does begin with education about GMOs and spreading the awareness about these sort of things, because it's still sort of new in the layman's mind that you can change genes. And I think awareness about that is very key, and I am very happy that iGEM actually looks towards education as a thing, because it really makes sense, because if you spread more awareness, people will be willing to accept things like this more soon.
Actually, we as university students often get stuck in bubbles where we think it's well-known knowledge that GMO products are safe. But the idea that we need to educate people on their safety and how important they are in meeting our future goals is something that we can't undermine. And I think that's one of the biggest things we learned, that consumer education is probably the biggest step that is there in adoption. Because regulators would change themselves if consumers are more open towards different products. And I think that's something that was one of the key takeaways, that insofar the consumers are willing to change their consumption patterns and are well educated about what is and what isn't, the adoption for new technologies is much more likely to happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think I can only agree with you too. Not much to add. So yeah, no, in that case, thank you very much for your time, guys. It was really interesting getting some insights. I think, understanding the situation, not only for my home, but also for different continents and countries and cultures, I think is quite insightful. So thank you very much for that. And I think on that note, we'll end the video.
Yep. Thank you so much, everyone.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
All right.